Hello, and welcome to the Special Ed Strategist podcast, brought to you by Learning Essentials. Learning Essentials offers special education-based support, educational therapy, academic therapy, and IEP coaching by state-certified educators with advanced degrees in all areas of special education. The Special Ed Strategist podcast brings professionals together to educate and empower families navigating special education needs and the IEP process.
Welcome to the Special Ed Strategist podcast, the pod that offers all things special ed. I'm your host, Wendy Taylor. If you want more tips, show us some love on social at Learning Essentials. If you are new to our podcast, give us a like and a follow. In this episode of Special Education Strategist, we are talking with a dyslexia specialist, what to look for and what to know. And we have today Natalie Powell. She is an educational therapist and an S-LDI dyslexia specialist, providing dyslexia therapy, assessment, consulting, and advocacy to adults and children across California. Natalie is a certified educational therapist through the Association of Educational Therapists and a certified structured literacy dyslexia interventionist through the Center for Effective Reading Instruction. She has 4 assessment locations throughout California, offers in-person therapy in El Dorado County, and provides advocacy and coaching services to families and professionals nationwide. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you for joining us today, Natalie.
Hi, Wendy. Thanks for having me.
You bet. So I'm really excited to have this conversation about students that are struggling with reading and helping our listeners and parents really navigate what to look for, what to do, how to ask for a specialist, and all of those good things. So I'm glad you're able to jump right in and help with this conversation.
Absolutely. I'm ready. Let's dig in.
Let's do this. So let's kind of just start from the top. At what age should parents begin working on phonics concepts with children?
So parents would want to start not necessarily with phonics concepts, but with just building the oral language skills of their children. So songs, nursery rhymes, just practicing rhyming around the house in a really playful way, labeling objects around the house and in conversation to give the kids exposure to that vocabulary. Just building those oral language skills is a huge part of preparing children to be ready to learn to read. I don't necessarily recommend that parents try to target phonics at home on their own, because if the child ends up being a struggling reader, that can actually really interfere with the parent-child relationship. And it's usually best if that is kind of outsourced and the reading instruction just takes place at school or with an outside professional. Now, the outside professional or the school could absolutely give suggestions for ways to reinforce at home, but I don't often recommend parents take the lead on the teaching reading process.
You know, and I love that you say that, and I can't say that enough, because a couple of things come to mind, you know, that preserving that parent-child relationship is so critical. And how you said to make things fun, to make things engaging, to not really force our younger kiddos to sit and do a workbook or rote memory, but just to really immerse them in language as they're around, going through the grocery store, doing things in their home, running errands, just really kind of doing a lot of talking out loud, right? And just having those conversations and allowing kids to hear what language sounds like and singing songs and reading together, I think is probably a more engaging way than sitting down with some flashcards and saying sounds. Right?
Because those foundational skills are so key. And I would also add, parents could also just stay aware of their child's articulation and how their speech is developing in terms of saying certain sounds like R, for example, because children with speech sound disorders are 50% more likely to have dyslexia. So again, that's an important area to get solid to help kids have those language and auditory skills that they're going to need to be successful readers.
So what could a parent look for if they're not necessarily trained for speech, language, and articulation? What could they you mentioned the R's. Are there anything else that they could kind of keep on their radar as they're, home with their little ones?
So if their child is having trouble with semantic memory concepts, so that would be just memorizing rhymes, memorizing the alphabet, getting the alphabet sequence correct without hesitations. Are they just able to sing it normally and with confidence? Can they tell you the names of colors, of basic shapes? So these kinds of skills tend to be late developing in kids that have dyslexia. And those are some very basic level skills that can be observed at home and even in preschool. And of course, difficulties with oral expression are also part of that, as we talked about. There can also be difficulties with fine motor skills, again, a precursor to literacy, because writing and spelling and handwriting are expressions of literacy. So if those are areas of difficulty for the student, they might need to do a little occupational therapy for strengthening the hand muscles and the fine motor skills to get the hand ready to properly hold a pencil and write. So those are some of the skills that parents and preschool teachers might see before the child is even introduced to reading as we think of it.
Right. And can you offer some suggestions in terms of some fun ways to approach just preparing for literacy? So as our little ones, like you had just mentioned, in terms of potential of occupational therapy and strengthen our hands, I know there's a lot of great things with, kids just running around, kind of leaning over and just adding pressure to their shoulders and arms, upper arms, and, running around with the big dump trucks on the playground. And then to also, pretend like they're painting a wall. So there's a lot of fun things that parents can do and kids can do that is all play-based, but has a purpose behind it. What are some fun ways that parents can engage their little ones to help kind of get them warmed up to preschool learning, to the precursor of reading?
So they can listen to different alphabet songs. There are so many now on YouTube. So if a child is having trouble remembering the traditional alphabet song, there are so many other versions now that are really fun, and they have cartoons that go with them. So it is very engaging. Just reading aloud to your child and having discussions with them, not just about the pictures, but having them predict what might happen next. Again, introducing the names and labels of the things in the pictures to give them exposure to that vocabulary, asking them what they think. So just making the read aloud really language rich from an expressive language perspective also are my main tips. And then any books that have rhyming involved are also really beneficial. And little kids think rhyming is really fun. And after a lot of exposure, they do get the hang of it. And I mean, a lot of my kindergartners will just rhyme for fun in our sessions. They think it's really entertaining. So rhyming is a fun, playful thing that parents can do too.
So at what age do children begin to exhibit signs or symptoms of dyslexia?
So recent research has actually suggested that precursors of dyslexia can be detected in infancy. So,
oh, wow.
Because dyslexia is an overall difference in brain organization, so it is a brain-based difference. And at age 5.5, roughly, dyslexia can be diagnosed with 92% accuracy. So already they don't need to have had very much exposure to print and letters to be showing these signs of dyslexia. Now, the statistics are even more striking if there's dyslexia in the family. So 1 in 5 people in general has dyslexia, and that's across cultures. If both parents have dyslexia, the chance of their child having dyslexia is 80%. So if both parents have dyslexia and their child is having trouble learning to read, it's a very safe bet that they're going to have dyslexia. So don't wait to get them the help. It can only benefit them. And then 40% of people with dyslexia have a dyslexic sibling. And if one parent has dyslexia, their child is 4 times more likely to have dyslexia. So this is highly genetic. The statistics say anywhere from 40 to 60% genetic. So that family tree is very powerful.
What are some most common misconceptions about dyslexia?
Oh, there are so many that I hear. The most common one would be seeing words backwards or words moving on the page. So those are actually 2 different things. So first, dyslexics don't see words backwards. They have trouble with directionality. So if they're reading the word on as no, they're not seeing it backwards. They see it the way you and I do, but they are just looking at it in the wrong direction. They're not going from left to right. So that leads people that maybe don't know a lot about dyslexia to think that's seeing the word backwards, when in fact it's not. It's just a directionality problem that is a huge part of dyslexia, not just in that area, but so many other areas as well, such as reversing B and D. There's what else? Wait and see. It might not be dyslexia. That's a common one. Waiting and seeing is the worst thing you can do, because the best developmental window to address dyslexia is before age 7. So by waiting and seeing, you're taking a really big gamble, because if you wait and see and it is dyslexia and you've waited until they're in 3rd grade, well, the most effective window has closed already. Dyslexia is rare, or if a child is having trouble learning to read, it could be a different reading problem, but not dyslexia. Dyslexia is the reading problem that would affect students learning to sound out words. There isn't another one. That's the one. Now, there are learning differences that just affect reading comprehension, but in terms of learning the words and learning to read, that would be dyslexia. And what else? They could be late bloomers. Late bloomers, that whole term doesn't have a lot of research support, because again, if a child's having trouble learning to read, they probably have dyslexia and they need the help ideally by age 7. But there are so many. There's a lot of misinformation out there. So I would urge parents to have a healthy sense of skepticism when they're reading things about dyslexia, especially on the internet.
Dr. Google. Are there
Yeah.
other learning difficulties that tend to coexist with the dyslexia diagnosis?
Yes. So I have some statistics here to just make this really concrete. So for a child that has dyslexia, or anyone, because again, I'm going to say child because I mostly work with children, but dyslexia is found in 1 in 5 people in general, not just kids. So 40% of people with dyslexia have dyscalculia, which is a math processing difference. It's sometimes referred to as math dyslexia, or I've heard one of my students say dyslexia with numbers. 25 to 40% of people with dyslexia have ADHD. 58% have developmental language disorder. And then, as I was saying, children with speech sound disorders are 50% more likely to have dyslexia. So a lot of comorbidity with dyslexia. And I read this and I thought it was so good. Dyslexia comes with friends. And it is so true, because of all the students that I've worked with, and I only work with kids with dyslexia, and I have for several years just focused on dyslexia. I don't know if I've ever had a student that only had dyslexia. There's always a friend in the mix.
There's always.
That's why having a multidisciplinary team is so important, because there's usually another type of assistance that's required as well.
Right.
And it's a therapy team.
Exactly. It all comes down to a team. So if a parent is suspecting something in the area of reading, can we talk a little bit about assessment and what they should do?
So again, I mentioned not waiting. Even if a child is in kindergarten, they can be exhibiting noticeable signs of dyslexia. So I would always recommend an assessment. Now, there are several options that parents can pursue if they're interested in an assessment. They could go through the school district if they're at a public school. They could get a private psychologist or neuropsychologist report, or they could go to an educational therapist such as myself if they just want to know specifically if their child has dyslexia. Now, this differs geographically. In my area, I am the only ed therapist that does assessment. I don't know if in your area there are more, or if you do, but generally the choice is really the school district or the psychologist. And there are pros and cons to each. A private assessment is extremely expensive.
Mm-hmm.
However, a school district assessment is usually not very thorough, and the purpose of each is very different. So the purpose of a school district assessment is not to give a label or a diagnosis. It's really just to see if the child meets their school specific criteria to enter their IEP program for the small group reading instruction. It is seeing if they meet a bar, basically. Whereas a private assessment is more interested in answering parent concerns and giving more detailed information about whole child. And then of course, there would be an actual diagnosis. So it really depends what parents are looking for and how much time and energy and money they want to put towards that process.
How do you help direct parents with that in terms of where to turn? And you're right, it does get difficult in the sense of what is the outcome that we're looking for and what is our hope that we're looking for in terms of which place to turn to. So do you help guide parents with that in terms of who to seek for assessments?
Yes. So I do assessments in my practice. So generally, once I assess a child, I won't recommend that they go through another assessment, because the purpose of assessment is to get the child the right help. And we don't want to prolong the testing process just for the sake of testing, because it's really hard on the kids and it's so cognitively demanding for them. We could never be done gathering data, but every day is precious when it comes to dyslexia intervention, and we want to get the ball rolling right away. So that is usually what I suggest. Now, I do assess quite a few students that have already been assessed by a school district, and the parent either didn't understand the report or didn't agree with the report. So my favorite example is I assessed a child for dyslexia who had had an IEP in phonological processing for 4 years already. And the parent did not know that the child had dyslexia. That's a problem. Yeah. So, and that's a perfect example of what can kind of happen with these school district assessments. There's a lot of jargon, and it's not necessarily parent-centered. So this parent did not know what phonological processing meant, as most parents will not. And that was never explained to her as synonymous with dyslexia. So my task was to really break down for her what the problem was and why what she was seeing with her child was indicative of dyslexia. And then to put together a plan to really help her, because by that point she was already in 4th grade and barely reading.
Right. And to help, give her the support that she needs to grow and to be confident as a learner. Right. What are some telltale signs for parents and teachers to look for when identifying a child who might be exhibiting some signs of dyslexia?
So for a teacher, the most visible sign is actually written work, because within a classroom environment, teachers don't really hear students reading aloud all that often unless they are raising their hand to volunteer to read. And students with dyslexia probably aren't doing that. So a teacher actually will have kind of a limited perspective on how a child sounds reading aloud, aside from the quarterly reading assessments that they're asked to give. So I always say, look at the written work, because the written work doesn't lie. So you would find messy handwriting, illegible handwriting at times. You would find reversals, not just of B and D, but P and Q. For the younger kids, reversing S, F, any letter that could be reversed, reversing numbers as well. In math work, reflecting numbers, so writing 15 as 51, copying from the board incorrectly, hand fatigue, the student complaining that their hand hurts, writing that starts out quite nice and then gradually deteriorates the farther you get down the paper, and then just terrible spelling problems, a lot of phonetic spelling, skipping sounds, And in general, written products that don't reflect the oral language skills that the child has, or that doesn't reflect the knowledge that they have of the concept. The writing always seems much simpler than what the child can actually tell you out loud. So that's a big indicator, the written products. In terms of listening to the reading and finding these telltale signs, kids with dyslexia very often prefer to guess when they see a word they don't know. And they will often guess based on the first letter of the word and what the context of the sentence is. So that's a huge sign, because they're guessing because they don't know how to sound out the word. It's not just that they're doing that because, and this is another one, they're lazy and they need to try harder, or they need to read more at home. This is not the issue. They just don't know how to decode that word. They may also skip words and skip lines. And if they do attempt to sound out a word, they might accidentally skip or add a sound. And then, of course, reversals, B and D, P and Q. And they may even, I actually have students that do this now, confuse the sounds of B and P, because they'll reflect a B and think it's a P, or vice versa. So those are all very powerful signs of dyslexia. These are things that are unique to dyslexia. So it wouldn't necessarily be another issue that you'd be noticing the signs of. And then for younger kids who are assigned, they could be called popcorn words, sight words, high frequency words, heart, whatever kinds of words they're supposed to memorize. If they're just having a lot of trouble memorizing these, and again, they seem to be just thinking of a word that starts with the first letter, I'm guessing, that is also a huge sign.
So if you were to put yourself in the shoes of a kiddo with dyslexia, what, just from your work with students, what do you see it as looking like or sounding like or feeling like for them?
I would sum it up as tiring, because the entire school day involves reading. It's not like you just read in reading class or your reading center. You're reading the entire day, not only in the subjects, but you're also just reading the board and you're reading a worksheet. I mean, words are all around you at school. And if you can't make sense of those words, that is extremely exhausting and tiring. So this is one of the reasons that I always try to see my dyslexia intervention kids before the end of the school day, whether I see them at school and they leave class to see me, or they leave school early or go late, because they are so spent by the end of the day because they've already been reading unsuccessfully for many hours. So it's tiring. It can also be embarrassing, not necessarily for the little ones who are not as obviously behind as their peers, like kindergarten and first graders, because no one's really a proficient reader yet. But for my third graders and up, it is embarrassing for them as well. And that's when you get some of the social emotional issues and low self-esteem and things like that that play into it. So dyslexia, when it's not being addressed, is very demoralizing.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, because it's just that cognitive capacity can only take so much during the school day, and then you're just exhausted.
Right. And these are kids that are already
point.
Working harder than their peers.
That's right.
Because it's all effortful.
How can you explain dyslexia to a kiddo in child or kid-friendly terms?
So I am a huge proponent of parents telling their child they have dyslexia, because kids are around their peers all day and they are noticing what their peers are able to do and that they are not able to do that. It is not that comforting for a parent to say, well, you just learn differently and you just need to be taught a different way. Well, that's kind of annoying, right? I mean, a child doesn't want to have trouble keeping up with their peers for some unknown reason. That's just how I learn. It's hard to take that as a positive. That doesn't really come with any positives, right? Whereas if a child has the term dyslexia, that news does come with positives, because there are so many strengths that come with dyslexia, and that should always be part of the conversation. So when I assess students for dyslexia, I always tell parents, just bring it up really casually. Don't have a formal sit down where you say, oh, okay, we have some news for you. You have dyslexia. So we don't want it to be very serious, very dire. We would just want it to be kind of delivered offhand, just giving them a little information about themselves, because you're really not telling them anything they don't already know. You're telling them, so you know how you have trouble with reading and or spelling, writing. Yes, they already know this. So you actually have dyslexia, and that's why. And that also means you're great at math, putting things together, Legos, sports, social things, fill in the blank. And dyslexia is really common. So a lot of people at your school also have dyslexia. You just don't know. So in your class of X amount of kids, at least 4 others also have dyslexia. So I'm always encouraging parents to give them the label because it will empower them. Emphasize the positives, be casual about it because we don't want them to, raise the alarm to the child, and emphasize that it is common and they are not the only one. So if there is a parent that struggled with reading, say that. Go ahead and tell the child that that parent has dyslexia, because a lot of parents weren't diagnosed in that generation. That wasn't that common. But just go ahead and say it, like, dad had trouble learning to read as well. He probably has dyslexia. And then the child has an immediate role model that they love and is their hero, and that is so successful in their eyes that they can then use as a beacon of hope. And same thing, peers have dyslexia too. And I actually tell the students, we do the calculation, however many kids in your class, this is how many will have dyslexia. So we want them to know they're in good company and it's not all bad. Lots of positives.
Lots of positives. And that way you put a term to it, and then they start to realize, okay, they can then better understand their learning style, and then start to learn processing or learn strategies to align with their learning style, so they can then start to feel more confident in what they're doing at school.
Right. And for teens also in particular, or even middle schoolers, they're on Instagram, they're on all the social media. And if you give them that term, they can then start looking up information themselves, and they often do. And that's going to help them with their self-advocacy. Whereas it's much harder to Google, I have trouble with this and this and this, and see what comes up. Whereas you could just Google dyslexia.
Right.
And then you have a bunch of resources. And this is also something that I tell parents who are afraid to give the label because they don't want to deflate their students' self-esteem. I heard this, I don't want to take credit for this. I think I heard this from a mentor or a class I took. If you don't give the child the label dyslexia, they will give themselves the label dumb. And I've seen that happen so often. On my intake forms, I actually have a question where it says, does your child say they're dumb? And 9 times out of 10, that box is checked.
Oh, yeah.
So
and
they
we
need to be empowered.
That's right. We need to flip that script and empower them. And like you said, help them with that advocacy piece that they're going to need. And that's a huge, huge thing. So we did talk a little bit about assessment. I kind of want to go back to that, if that's all right. What is the difference between a screening and an assessment?
So a screening would be brief. I usually just do screenings for kids that have very limited knowledge of reading. So preschoolers that are toward the end of preschool, or kindergartners, just to get a sense of the very, very basic skills. Whereas a full assessment would look at processing. So phonological processing being a main one, other processing areas, spelling, handwriting, reading, assuming the child has had exposure to some extent to all of those areas so that I could assess them all and get an accurate reading. A screening is more time efficient. So it's usually just a first step to see if maybe the student should receive intervention, tutoring, etc., or if later on they should receive a full assessment.
What are the next steps? So assume a parent goes through, they receive their results, they do an assessment. What would the next steps be once the parents get the diagnosis, or they understand that there's a reading an impact with reading, a written expression, what are the next steps?
So I would suggest finding an Orton Gillingham trained educational therapist, specialist, or tutor in your area. Intervention for dyslexia should always be one-on-one. And that is why I recommend private services if possible, because in schools, there's one resource teacher for the entire school site, which means small groups. And the true Orton Gillingham, the way that it's meant to be delivered is one-on-one, because it's supposed to be completely tailored to that learner and guided by diagnostic teaching. So however they respond to what you teach them, you then pivot and make the next lesson decision based on how they did. So it's completely personalized, and you can't do that with a small group. So places to look for someone with this training: parents can go on the Association of Educational Therapists website, search for a therapist by their state. Educational therapy is very broad, just like any other therapy area. So you would still want to make sure that the therapist in your area does have some sort of Orton Gillingham training. It might not be called Orton Gillingham. It may be called Wilson trained, Yoshimoto Orton Gillingham trained, IMSE trained, but they're all referring to the same kind of approach. Parents can also go on the Center for Effective Reading Instruction website. So that's what I'm certified through. It doesn't have as large a pool of professionals as the Ed Therapy website, but it is a good place to look because everyone listed on that site does have Orton Gillingham training. And you can also look on the Find a Therapist feature on the International Dyslexia Association website. So those are the primary resources where you could find local people. I do urge parents to make sure the person actually has Orton Gillingham training and isn't just saying uses Orton Gillingham approaches. Because the training in how to remediate dyslexia is key. Anyone can say they're using these kinds of approaches, right? Anyone can just put a sand tray in front of a child and tell them to read a word. But there's so much more than that. So the training is key.
What would a parent ask for, right? So if a parent is giving you a ring and they're looking for somebody that can do structured literacy, that can do, one-on-one, is there anything specific that a parent should ask for in addition to how are you trained? What does that look like? And, instead of beyond, are you trained? Is there something specific a parent should ask for, or should they know about?
So I would ask if the person offers 30-minute sessions. And the reason I say that is because, speaking from experience, the kindergarteners and first graders really struggle with a traditional 50-minute to 1 hour tutoring / therapy session. And it can be a challenge for both therapist and child. I am always a proponent of frequency over duration. So twice a week for 30 minutes when the child is focused will be much better than once a week for an hour, or even an hour and a half, which I have heard of for a kindergartner. That is really rough. So I would try to maximize their attention and engagement as much as possible. And that's usually having a shorter session multiple times per week. I would also ask the professional if they use a scripted curriculum or if they use more of an eclectic approach. So Barton, for example, is a scripted program that is Orton Gillingham based. So it is meant for kids with dyslexia, but it can be not the most engaging, especially again for the little ones, because it is scripted and everything is pre-planned. So therapists that does more activities and more hands-on work and more eclectic selection of activities would be ideal. But these are all, again, preferences. Parents should know it can be very difficult to find this kind of support. There are not enough educational therapists and dyslexia specialists. So if you find one with openings, definitely snatch those up.
with openings is key. And you're
Yes.
absolutely right. In the state of Maryland, I'm only one of 2 that are certified as educational therapist.
Oh, are you full? There you go. Yes.
And I did have a parent reach out, and I did have an opening, and she asked a couple questions and then quickly emailed back and said, I spoke to a psychologist and they said, if you had an opening, don't ask any more questions. Just take
There you
the
go.
spot.
Yes. So I guess I should give the caveat. If you have numerous choices, take the advice that I just gave. But if you find one ed therapist and they have openings, do not hesitate, get on the schedule, because it will be very hard to find that again.
Yeah, it is true. It is true. But what different therapy options do you suggest for young learners that are diagnosed? So we kind of talked a little bit about that. Did we miss anything?
So some learners that are just diagnosed do also attend occupational therapy, as I was kind of mentioning, because usually they're having trouble with their pencil grasp, and writing time at school is very arduous. So some come to me once a week and then they do OT once a week. Some also have those speech issues that I mentioned. So they'll do speech once a week and see me once a week. So a lot of the intervention is meant to prevent further issues later on. Always best to address these things right away when the children think therapy is just fun and they think it's all games and they're really engaged and they don't mind going. That's the best time.
That is the best time. And that's the goal, I think, of any session, regardless of the age, is you want the connection, first and foremost, that the student feels connected with the person that they're working with, that they feel safe, they feel that they're learning, that they're growing, and that they feel that during those sessions, they are engaged in a way that they don't feel like it's one more thing on their plate. And I share that often with parents. Right. You want the kid to walk away and be like, oh yeah, I want to go back and see them again. That was fun. Or I enjoyed that. I don't feel like this is one more thing added. So what are some common short and long-term goals for young learners that are dealing with dyslexia?
So common short-term goals would be around phonics and phonological awareness usually. So something really concrete like mastering the vowel teams, for example. So E, EA, reading one syllable words that contain those, spelling words with those vowel patterns, and then maybe segmenting words that have a long vowel sound. So like how many sounds are in tree, t, e. So we want students to be able to do all three. Read the word, spell the word, and segment the word. And that shows us that the connection is really strong in the brain for that word form. A long-term goal would usually be related to fluency, which is a long-term goal in every sense of the word, because fluency is really at the core of what dyslexia is. A student that has mastered all of their short-term goals, like I just talked about, they've mastered how to sound out a word, how to segment it, how to spell it, they still may not recognize it automatically when they're reading. So helping them get that automaticity so that reading isn't so time consuming and just cognitively demanding, so they can focus on understanding what they're reading and interacting with the text, is always the end goal for educational therapy. And I would also add to that, spelling is a very long-term goal as well, because that's another area that to some extent will always be a stumbling block for someone with dyslexia, right? Because we can't teach them how to spell every single word. We teach them generalizations and helpful tricks to help them reason through the options for how to spell a word. But there are so many words to learn to spell and we can't do them all. So usually written expression, emphasis on spelling, and then fluency.
And how do we better support fluency?
So that's actually one of my foremost areas of interest in terms of the research. So a big topic right now in the dyslexia world for increasing fluency is orthographic mapping. And it's a method where the student looks very carefully and inspects every aspect of a word, so they can segment it, read it, and spell it. And the methods that are used, one of them is called heart words, where they memorize the irregular part of a word by putting a heart there. And it's truly mapping, because it's creating a map of the word basically. And that is a really popular strategy right now to increase fluency and automatic word recognition. So I do a lot of that with my students, and it is very powerful. The main difficulty in achieving fluency is getting the reading speed up, because I've worked with a lot of students that are older and they have had intervention in the past, and they can read, at grade level roughly, they can read any material that's given to them at school, but the reading is slow. And so that makes them avoid reading, and it can interfere with comprehension. So for increasing the reading speed there and the fluency, my students and I do repeated reading of not just sounds in isolation and not just words, but also phrases and sentences and paragraphs. So at every stage of text length, to try to get that speed up in every way.
What is the difference then between processing and literacy?
So phonological processing is the ability to hear and manipulate the parts of words. So it is an auditory skill. A student can have the ability to rhyme and segment sounds in words. So like, what's the first sound in gum? G, but still struggle to read. So the key is combining those skills with print, with letters. And that's how a dyslexia therapist is different from a speech therapist. So a speech therapist would just work on the phonological processing, the ability to make sense of parts of words, right? And some speech therapists do actually have phonological awareness goals that they target in sessions, but not with letters, not with print. So that's where we come in. We show the children how to use that knowledge of hearing the sounds in words to then spell and decode words.
So what is the difference then between phonological awareness and phonemic awareness?
So this is a common area of confusion. So phonological awareness is the ability to work with whole words. So rhyme, think of words that all start with the same sound, like funny and from. We'll start with breaking a sentence into individual words, breaking words into syllables, blending into words. So it's at the word level. And these are the most basic level skills that are developed first. A lot of these are addressed in preschool. Phonemic awareness is working within the sounds in a word. So breaking a word down into sounds, substituting sounds, eliminating sounds just from a word. So it's a specific type of phonological awareness.
And then how is phonological memory different from sight words?
So phonological memory would be the ability of a child to lock in a certain sequence of sounds. So students that have trouble with phonological memory often have trouble learning a foreign language because they can't remember that particular sequence of sounds that makes up that foreign word. They might also have trouble with learning new vocabulary words in English, or even just remembering the names of people. Typically, people with dyslexia have trouble with names, pronouncing people's names, remembering the correct pronunciation. All of that is kind of related to phonological memory. Memorizing sight words is related to orthographic memory, which is visual memory, but specifically for words. So locking the word form into memory. So one of them is auditory, that would be phonological memory. And then sight words is dependent on orthographic memory, which has that visual component.
And then that will all tie into reading comprehension eventually, correct?
That is the end goal. The end goal of putting all these pieces together. And it is so complicated, right? There are so many different areas of processing that we have just mentioned. And for someone where these don't come naturally, that's a lot of different processing areas that need to be addressed and targeted, right? So that the end goal and the hope of addressing all of those is that reading will get easy enough to the point that a student can focus on understanding what they're reading, and reading not just being an exercise in decoding words, but focusing on the whole, seeing the forest, not the trees, to put it another way. And comprehension is typically what gets more heavily emphasized in students in middle school and high school, when there's more vocabulary work that needs to be done, filling in the gaps from the time that they maybe didn't spend reading when they were struggling readers as kids, giving them that vocabulary knowledge now so they can make sense of these dense texts that they're expected to read.
Do you have any tips on helping improving reading comprehension?
So reading comprehension is a really interesting skill because it's not a standalone skill, kind of like reading fluency. It is just a combination of many skills coming together. So it is a function of fluency and oral language comprehension. So the best way to become a strong comprehender is to be a fluent reader. So have all these processing areas that we talked about solid, having good oral language comprehension skills. And another one that's a tricky one to teach, it can be built up, but not only vocabulary, but background knowledge. Background knowledge is a big one because if you think about a non-dyslexic reader, so such as myself, my comprehension, even though I'm a fluent reader, is not going to be good if I am reading a manual on cars, because I'm not going to make sense of anything that I'm reading because I just can't visualize it and I don't have that background information. So that's where reading for pleasure becomes very important. And it doesn't have to necessarily be reading with your eyes. It could be ear reading. So listening to audiobooks, watching educational YouTube videos, TV shows, just anything that has some sort of intellectual component becomes so important, because if you're doing that recreationally, you amass so much background knowledge that it's really going to help you comprehend, even if your fluency isn't that strong. Because the person that reads the car manual that I was talking about and understands cars is going to comprehend it better than me, even if their fluency isn't that strong. So it also can be a lot about compensating for comprehension. If you have a strong vocabulary and oral skills and background knowledge, that can really help you get through.
Yeah. And then where does visualization come in? You had mentioned that.
Yeah. So in order to visualize what you're reading, you do have to have some level of executive functioning. So there we add another ingredient into the mix.
There's your other
reading
friend.
comprehension, right? So it is truly a combination of so many skills. And this is where kids with ADHD and dyslexia tend to have a hard time, because even after they've become pretty fluent readers, and if they have a good vocabulary, so good oral language skills, but they're losing their focus while they're reading, they're still not going to understand. So that's where educational therapy, especially educational therapists that really specialize in ADHD and those kind of metacognitive, as they're called, strategies to help you monitor your own response to the reading, help you understand and notice, oh, I'm spacing out, I need to reread that. That becomes very important too.
Right. And learning tricks and skills and strategies to go along with that. So just the importance of knowing, again, kind of back to where we started, knowing who you are as a learner and aligning yourself with a team that has the training to support your learning needs and can help teach you strategies and guidance to help you grow.
Right. And study skills can also factor in with reading comprehension in terms of note-taking and highlighting and working memory strategies. So a lot of learners in high school that are having trouble with reading comprehension, even if they don't have dyslexia, just ADHD, they do work with executive functioning coaches who really specialize in helping learners get meaning from what they're reading.
Gotcha. This is a lot to think about, right? And to kind of take into play here. As we winding down here, what is something that I didn't know enough to ask that I should have asked when we talk about dyslexia and reading intervention and assessments?
Yeah, so I think maybe I can just address some of the specific strengths that come with dyslexia, since I did mention a few of them before, but there are so many strengths and they can be really helpful in helping kids compensate. Now, you don't want them to have to constantly rely on compensating because that is also exhausting, but these strengths do help a lot. So some of the common areas of strength for kids with dyslexia are math, creative pursuits, art. A lot of them have great social skills. They're very intuitive, high emotional intelligence. They're often very hard workers by necessity. They kind of have to be. And they're definitely some of the hardest workers that I've ever met. They work harder than I ever had to in school. And they're kind of expected to do that from a young age. They can be really talented in design, really good with tech, engineering, really good listeners. They have amazing memory for what's called narrative memory, or things that happened in the past, or things that happened even in books. Really strong long-term memory and a great imagination. So these are all skills that benefit you so much in the real world. Unfortunately, there are more limited opportunities to take advantage of these in school, but they can still help students feel successful if they're able to use some of these strengths in reading related areas.
Exactly. And I think we also didn't touch upon that if a parent has a concern, if they do an outside assessment, to certainly circle back to the school and go through the process to see if that student would qualify for a 504 or an IEP, so that they can have additional accommodations and goals and support through their school day, in addition to any external support that they're getting.
Right. So those two different options, 504 or an IEP, just to quickly explain the differences. 504 is just accommodations. So there's no services. And then an IEP involves accommodations and some sort of small group reading support. Quality can vary, programs vary widely between districts, schools, states. So definitely parents should look into what is being offered in their school's IEP program. Are the students receiving Orton Gillingham reading instruction in resource? Important to be educated on that.
And what's available in the school. Absolutely.
Right.
So one final question. If you could have a billboard with one tip for parents, what would it be and why?
It would be, it's probably dyslexia. Because so of all the dyslexia assessments that I've done, I've probably done about 120-ish. I believe, and I did tabulate this recently, I think about 5 of them came back negative. So it's a very safe referral to make. It's already a pretty high statistic. 1 in 5 people has dyslexia. And then if the child is struggling to learn to read, that's probably what it is. So don't wait and wonder. It is probably dyslexia. Start finding the help.
I love that. What a good final answer. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. And thank you everybody for joining the Special Ed Strategist podcast. Again, I'm your host, Wendy Taylor. And if you want more tips, go show us some love on social at Learning Essentials, and make sure you like and follow our podcast. Thank you so much, Natalie. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you for joining us today for our Special Ed Strategist podcast. To hear more pro tips and find additional IEP essentials, including our IEP webinar, please visit www.learningessentialsedu.com.